hearing from what President Trump seems very fairly confident. He's projecting that attitude that Iran will come to the negotiating table, and he's framing it in quite clear terms. He's essentially saying that a deal is possible, that it will be better, but that's his phrasing than the 2015 arrangement, and it will ultimately deliver stability, not just not just in the region, but more broadly. Now, when you strip all that political language away, and what this tells you is that Washington's still working on the assumption that pressure combined with diplomacy, the way they try to pressure Iran, will eventually bring Iran into the structured agreement. There are a lot of issues with this, and I'll come into this. The focus, at least from the side, is very clearly on a new deal, one that is described as stronger, and he's always saying this, but that's just political talk, I think, and more comprehensive and more forcible than it existed before. And this is where historical reference points comes in. More importantly, because we can't really understand the current situation without going back to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. That this is the one that's the real issue that was withdrawn. The agreement, as we know, was built around very specific technical constraints on Iran's nuclear program. It limited enrichment levels, stockpiles, centrifuge capacity, and it in return provided phased sanctions relief for Iran. And also embedded a verification structure through the IAEA, which is giving inspectors a more formal mechanism to monitor compliance under the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty Framework. In purely technical terms, however, the structure worked. The system of monitoring verification was real, and it was enhanced under the agreement. And that was then. Now, the real political issue, the real issue is political durability, because the agreement ultimately collapsed when the United States withdrew from it, the Trump administration in 2018. And that withdrawal fundamentally changed the trust environment between the United States and especially the way that Iran trusts the United States when it feels that it can't. Once that precedent exists, every future negotiation is straight by it. That Iran feels that they can't trust the Americans not to go away, and another agreement, one will be changed again. And now negotiation, the terms of any deal, but the credibility of whether any deal can survive any political leadership change. And there are regular elections in the United States. So when we hear about a better agreement or a strong, really it's being tested not just in the technical design, but in the political trust. Now let's get into what's really going on the ground. What we're seeing now is whether there's a maritime pressure, diplomatic signaling on both sides. Both sides are trying to show that they're pretty strong, but there's also that same trust deficit there. Iran is approaching any discussion with that memory of past withdrawal, and that enforces that pressure on their side, whether they can come along with this. And given that there's a blockade, that reduces that trust in the long term. And the United States is approaching with the argument that stronger enforcement. You see, they see it from pressuring Iran. Iran won't give in from that pressure, but it looks at the wider picture. And both sides are in fact trying to solve the same problem, but from different starting points. So when we look at it in a strategic perspective, sorry, this is why current talks, or even the idea of talks, are so sensitive. It's not just about nuclear thresholds or sanctions relief. It's about whether an agreement can actually survive the political change on both sides. And so if there is a survival, if there is another change in Iran, will the new government in Iran in the future stick to it? Or will the Americans stick to it when the Democrats eventually come back in? Or another president who wasn't on board with this. And that's the thing that we're facing. Rather than the small things that are happening on the ground right now, what we're facing is a dialogue of trust.
Absolutely. Dr. Auqaab, the thing that comes to my mind is when it comes to the various sanctions placed on Iran by the United States, the element of economic initiatives or sanctions, when we discuss these, do we feel that the sanctions relief or these incentives could basically pursue Iran to accept stricter peace negotiations?
You see, you've got to look at it having followed this virtually every day, what's been going on in the Middle East, I'm recognizing that actually what the US may fail to understand is that Iran is in a very strong position still. It may have been devastated in many different ways, but not everything that the Americans say that they've done to it has actually turned out that way. And Iranians have a lot of resolve in this, primarily because they want to finish this once and for all. They want to make an agreement, but they don't want it to collapse again later on for another. This is where I come back to this again and again. And they've been saying this consistently. They're looking at the long term. They don't just want agreement and then next year they're attacked again by maybe Israel and America for some other reason. They want something that stands for a long time. They want something that stands in history and then carries on, and they can work on that, because otherwise they're still in that siege mentality. And I think that we need to recognize that more than anything else. These are the things, the cargo vessel the other day, and the blockade are small aspects of the larger picture. And I think you need to recognize that Iran will come to the table. They both want this. They both want a structured understanding and how to engage, but they also want the Iranians want the Americans to show some trust. They want them to have a little give as well, whilst the Americans want the same. And what I recognize is that the way it's really going to work is that you look from the outside, you look at the edges, you don't look at the core agreement completely, you start working for the things that you can change, and you build that positive alignment between the two countries and slowly work towards. And this is the process. I don't think this process is going to happen overnight or in a week. It could take a few more sessions at least, and that slowly that will build up that trust between them to understand that they're willing here. Small things may not matter individually, but as a whole, they could have significant impact, and that could lead to the core issues being discussed more openly, and there being a lot of give in that respect.
So, Dr. Auqaab, you're basically saying that for Iran, the United States is an existential threat unless these negotiations are truly successful and they are better negotiated for Iran's future. Is that so?
That's absolutely right. And that's what everything I've said is based on how Iran is going to trust whether this is secure for next year. Yesterday and the day before, there was an understanding that some of the hard measures that they were talking about, the core issues that the United States was talking about, such as the 20-year non-enrichment, for example, they've pushed it down to 15. It may not be 15, but the fact that they did indicates there's movement. And I reckon that there's probably even further movement. Iran wants it just as 5. I think there's going to be a certain give. Maybe it'll settle at 10 years. Uh, but furthermore, I think it's the other issues like sanctions relief. But that's not going to happen overnight as well. There may be an immediate release of funds, frozen funds around the world, because the Americans want that. But also there may be for the legislation itself.
So how is this trust deficit supposed to be rebuilt, given the fact that Pakistan is a key player in this? And Pakistan, recently, we saw that the Field Marshal, Sayyid Asim Munir, had traveled to Iran for a 3-day visit, and then the Prime Minister of Pakistan had a tri-nation tour. We're trying to gather all of these countries, trying to make sure that they understand the situation at hand, explaining to them why the talks are actually of imperative, need of the hour. So that being said, my question to you would be, Trump mentioned that he's saying that there will be a better deal. So what could a better deal be interpreted as in terms of realistic achievability?
That will take time, because legislation to unhook that from the legislative process does take time. And we're going to have to look at the process incrementally then. And there's going to be a buildup of that trust initially. I think that's what they're working towards more than anything else.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for providing us with your expertise and your valuable insights, viewers. This was international relations expert Auqaab Alizai.